good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for spending a little time to learn about what we saw in our Internet Security Report for last quarter. We'll go into a little bit of detail of what we cover in that report if you haven't heard these webinars before. But before we do, let me introduce myself. I'm Corey Knockreiner, the CSO, or you can also call me CISO of WatchGuard Technologies. So I run our security for our enterprise with my team, including folks like Trevor and others you'll meet in a second. Before that, I was the CTO, and we just ran the threat lab and did a lot of research into the underground, what criminals are doing, what are the new hacking techniques so that we could help protect our customers. Before we dive in, let me also hand it off to Trevor to introduce himself.
Thanks, Corey. My name is Trevor. I've been at WatchGuard for the last 8 years, and I started working on the support side of WatchGuard, and Corey and Mark had me join their team a couple years ago, and I've been working with them, especially on this report, on gathering the data and analyzing it so that we can present it to you. And thanks, Corey, for having me back.
Oh, it's always great to have you, Trevor. And I'm sure he's been a little humble. He also is a coder and scripter that helps us do all kinds of technical things in the threat lab and helps run our incident response SOC. So happy to have his experience. Besides that, me and Trevor are presenting this, but do know the report is the work of many authors. From webinars, you probably are used to also knowing I'm joined by Mark LaLiberty, who's my right-hand man and director of security operations. He's traveling to speak, I believe, in Europe right now, so exciting times for him, but Trevor's joining us today. We also have John Schilling, an intrusion analyst, Ryan Estes, who actually is a malware analyst for our endpoint team now, does some deep malware analysis. If you do have any of our endpoint products and they ever submit unknown files, well, if our machine learning and automated malware analysis doesn't tell for sure that they're good or bad, they might end up on Ryan's desk. And of course, we have Josh, who's another intrusion analyst who handles the network attack section of the report. So lots of authors. Today, the agenda is pretty typical for how we cover this report. The report is broken up in different sections, so we're going to start with what we call the firebox feed trends, and I'll talk about what that entails in a moment. In fact, I'll ask you what you think it entails first. But essentially, these are the trends that we learned from our network security appliance, a unified threat management or next generation firewall, depending on your acronym of choice, that has a number of malware detection security services, DNS security services, IPS, and much more. So based on customer devices that have opted in, we get a lot of data about the types of threats that have been targeting our customers around the world through that network security device. We'll share some of those top trends, how encrypted malware differs versus unencrypted malware, some regional trends, and a little bit about what malicious DNS domains we see in the firebox feed section. But also 3 years ago, we acquired an endpoint product. It was previously called Panda Security. Now it's WatchGuard EPDR, a fantastic product that does, of course, normal endpoint protection and endpoint detection and response, but also has a number of additional endpoint-related security services too. So we also take a look at malware from the endpoint perspective, which does differ quite a bit from the network. We tend to see through the network, the attacker might be trying to gain the first stage of an attack. So you might see malware associated with stagers, droppers, or the first initial root cause of malware. Whereas from the endpoint perspective, if they've gotten that far, they might be dropping the actual child payload. So sometimes we see a slightly different perspective of malware from the endpoint report. We also try to cover either a threat lab research topic or big security story of the month technically every quarter. Last quarter, while it previously happened a few quarters ago, LastPass, a very well-known password manager, one that I've even used, had a breach. And in Q4, they learned more about the kind of root cause of the breach. And so in our top security incident of the month, we talk a little bit more about the LastPass breach, how it's alleged to have happened, because while LastPass has confirmed some parts of it, Some of what you'll hear is confirmed by other security researchers too. And we'll take away some security lessons from that breach and how it happened. And again, the point of this isn't just to talk about, what the bad guys are doing. We don't want the focus to be on attackers. It's more on what we can do to make sure we're protected from the latest threats. We do this report simply by learning these trends, by figuring out what the trends are that the bad guys or threat actors are using. It makes us all able to adjust our defenses a little to make sure to protect against them. So that's what we'll be covering. And for the Firebox feed, before I start, I will tell you what the Firebox feed is, but this is our first polling question. What do you think the Firebox feed includes? Select all the services you apply that apply. Earlier, we mentioned that the Firebox feed is based on data from our network security firewall, including some of the different services you can add to it. Whether you add basic security or total security to our products, you get some of these different features. What do you think we look at for the report? And as you can see, almost all of you, or most of you, guessed all of those. And like I said, we didn't give the easy answer, the sixth answer. If we had said all of the above, I bet you most of you would have picked that. And that is correct. All of these things are analytics we look at for the Internet Security Report. I will say, Trevor can tell you, for 2 reports ago, for all the reports previous to that, we hadn't looked at Intelligent AV for a little while because basically there's a change in the way we report that data, and there were slight dynamics that we thought were incorrect. But we have since, adjusted our scripts and how we look at that data. So even Intelligent AV, which is our machine learning based AV, is part of our report again now. So moving on to really answer that question like you all did get right, really all the Firebox feed is anonymized. And what I mean by that is we're not collecting any IPs about our customer's network. The only thing we really care about is where in the world their Firebox is. So we do use the external IP to kind of geolocate the general country it is in the world. And then we care about the different malware, network attack, and DNS hits. And as you just answered, we are looking at malware, so we analyze every single one of our malware services. If you've read our report or heard this before, you know we have technically 4 if you include TDR or WatchGuard EPDR Core, but the basic network ones are Gateway Antivirus, which is a signature-based service primarily. Intelligent AV, which is the one we added back, which is entirely it creates machine learning rules based on big data and is able to catch new executables and other types of executable malware very quickly that a human may not have recognized as malware. So it can catch what I sometimes call zero-day malware that doesn't have a signature, but you don't have to wait for it to be unpacked in behavioral analysis because it uses a number of machine learning generated factors to figure out if something is malicious or not. That said, while machine learning is great at proactively catching malware, it doesn't catch every new thing. So I'd say one of our strongest services is APT Blocker. This is a behavioral malware detection sandbox where if we haven't seen a file before, gets submitted to a sandbox, which the technical term is we detonate it. But what that really just means is we run whatever file type it is in a normal Windows or target system that has all the normal programs like Office and Adobe that you might use. And we pay attention to the behaviors of what the file does or process or executable or whatever. And by paying attention to the behaviors, it doesn't really matter how attackers have changed the malware or made it look different to evade signatures. They always have to do whatever malicious thing, such as encrypt your files for ransomware or so on, and that is what we detect. So it includes all 3 of our anti-malware services, like you guys answered. Also for the network attack section, that is driven by our intrusion prevention service. So designed to catch both server-based and client-based attacks that leverage software vulnerabilities. So it could be vulnerabilities in Chrome, or it could be vulnerabilities in your IIS server or some other on-premise or cloud server. That shows us the type of network attacks bad guys are going after. And finally, DNS Watch is our DNS firewall. If your users do accidentally click on malware or phishing or drive-by download links, DNS Watch can typically block that access because we recognize all the dynamic and always growing domains that are sending threats. So basically all the data you see is from different services like those on the firewall. So let's jump into that. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to add in one additional point, just to let you finish the list before I jumped in on this. The intelligent AV, just to make it clear, the intelligent AV has always been as useful and at the percentage of that, a significant percentage of the malware that it has caught. Unfortunately, we just had a issue with gathering the feed data, but this quarter you should see in clearly how well the intelligent AV has been acting over the last few years.
Yeah, if I wasn't clear, it was not the efficacy of the product. The product was working. It was a change in how we reported the analytics to the back end that gathers all this data we use. And old boxes would report hits one way and new boxes had changed the way they reported hits. So no change in how the product worked, but to us, because we didn't immediately look at the new way, our analytics were off a bit. So as Trevor said, statistical, analytic tracking issue on our part, not an issue with the efficacy of the product. Good point, Trevor. So with that, I'm actually about to hand it to Trevor to really cover the malware section which he writes. But before we do, going to hit some high level trends just so you get the high level. The first thing is this is an opt-in, for your device. If you are a WatchGuard customer, you do have to opt in before you send any data to us. We respect all kinds of privacy laws, and as I mentioned, it's data that we anonymize. We're not interested in sharing any information or even knowing much about your network and setup. We just want to know about the threats out there. But the amount of reporting opted in fireboxes right now is, just about 81,500. Just a bit under that. Just so you know, we have many more active and licensed fireboxes out there. So this just probably represents, at this point, maybe 15%. I'm thinking on my toes, so don't hold me to that. But it definitely doesn't represent all the boxes out there. If you haven't opted in, it's definitely useful to us and hopefully useful to you learning this information to opt into that. So a number of boxes, while it's not all of them, 81,000 is definitely statistically relevant. From a malware standpoint, I think the main overall theme is malware seems to have dropped overall in Q4. Here you can see both basic malware. What we mean by that is things that are signature-based malware detection catches, JV, about 11.8 million for that number of fireboxes. And then evasive malware, which is more that zero-day malware that might be new enough that it doesn't have a signature that either IAV, intelligent AV, or APT blocker catch, which as you can see is just a bit under 4 million. So still catching a lot of threats, but overall it's down. One interesting thing, and Trevor will talk a lot more about it, is we are seeing plenty of malware, in fact more, an increase of 220%, malware being detected through encrypted communications, specifically HTTPS, otherwise known today as TLS. So there's a lot of malware happening over encryption. And that will bring us to one of the themes me and Trevor will talk about in a moment. The other thing we track is because we track basic and evasive malware. Remember, evasive malware is what we call zero-day malware because there's no signature yet. Our zero-day malware percentage dropped quite a bit, probably one of the lowest lows we've seen in years at only 43%. Now, I want to remind you, 43% of malware getting past signature-based detection is still a big deal, right? I wouldn't want to miss 4/10 of malware. But it is much lower. We've seen that as high as 70%, so it's a bit unusual. But we have a theory about that, which we'll get to in a second. I want to make sure to leave a lot of other stuff for Trevor to cover in the malware section, so that will be the first bit of highlights. I will say that the two other highlights I want to cover that we'll get to in more detail later is again, that encrypted malware, the malware we see growing in encrypted channels, we suspect, based on boxes that do look at encrypted malware, which we, Trevor, you tell me it ranges from maybe 17% to 24%. So we averaged it out around 20%. Only about 20% of the fireboxes out there do we see customers configure the ability to inspect encrypted traffic. And yet 93% of the malware that goes through those boxes is through encryption. So what that proves to us is most malware is trying to hide an encryption. And if you're not decrypting malware, you're not really seeing or decrypting HTTPS connections. You're not seeing the full story of what's really happening in the malware world. So we believe things like even the drop we're seeing in malware is because about 80% of the boxes are only showing us their clear channel malware, and they're not doing any HTTPS inspection. We suspect malware might be going up behind the scenes. It's just happening all in that encrypted connections that many people aren't looking at from a network level. The other thing we'll talk about later is we don't see a lot of ransomware family detections directly on the firebox. Probably has to do more with me mentioning before that when you see malware at the network level, that's before it's hit the endpoint, and it's probably more concerned with the stager to deliver ransomware later. But from an endpoint perspective, ransomware rose quite a bit, 627%, and we'll talk about that in a moment. With that said, why don't I shoot it off to Trevor to go ahead and go into more detail about what we saw in malware. And if I don't follow along clicking in time, feel free to let me know, Trevor.
Not a problem. Thanks, Corey. So yeah, as Corey was talking about the malware, we're going to start getting into some of the details. And so the first details that I wanted to get into was the top 10 malware. So this is just the top 10 overall malware that we have seen by the most prominent count. So the top malware that we saw here in Q4 was the JS Agent UNS. This is a type of phishing page, and I'll go into a little bit more detail later. Another new malware, which is also a phishing page, was the HTML Agent WR. We'll go into that as well. I do want to just point out for later, just keep track of this number here, 321,000. And because this says also, we'll see this in encrypted malware. Then moving on though, the last one that we see is this last phishing page. This is the agent GBPM, and so that's another page. So three new phishing pages, and also, well, this is a phishing page, but it's also it's going to redirect you. So it most of the time it redirects you to a phishing page.
The detection on this probably would be catching more like HTML files or documents or Word files that have what I'm asking Trevor, not just telling, but what JAV probably caught in the background wasn't the phishing page, but was probably a file that had a link that went to the phishing page. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. This is what the agent UNS, the top hit there. I apologize. I guess you don't see my mouse.
I'm trying to.
So the top, yeah, there you go. Yeah. So the top hit is the agent UNS, which is it's catching the link to the phishing pages. So,
and as you mentioned, this is, when you said it's the most prominent, this is by pure raw volume. This doesn't take into account, how many fireboxes. It could be one firebox. I mean, it's never going to be just one, but it could be a small number of fireboxes that just get this repeatedly, or it could be lots of fireboxes, but we don't really pay attention to that. This is purely by volume. The other question I wanted to ask you, just to set you up, Trevor, is we do see a lot of repeats on some of our top 10 lists quarter for quarter. But I would say, and I'm asking if you agree, that the antivirus, our malware list, does tend to change. You know, there are some good old ones that we see pretty regularly that go up and down. But I would say we see new stuff more often than not on this list, unlike the network list, which we'll get to later, which often has the same threats. Is that true, that this at least changes a bit, other than
We
maybe
do.
ones like generic, which catch all kinds of things?
We do. We absolutely will see new ones. There is definitely the top 15, top 20 of the list is fairly regular, but we do see a lot of new malware in the top 10 list, at least compared to IPS, which is pretty much stagnant over quarters.
Yeah.
There are, we for example, we have been seeing this CVE 2018-0802, the Office exploit. This Office exploit here, we'll see in the malware section. So when the malware section, we'll catch a lot of that Office exploits, and this is what Corey was talking about, where the network GAV is going to catch different than an endpoint, and the reason is that we're catching the Office file itself at the network side, and then on the endpoint, it's actually catching the PowerShell script. And so
Yeah.
this is some of the differences that we'll see. Even though they're the same file, they're catching different parts of the malware
So what
and
you're saying,
categorizing it
basically, that
differently.
Word document probably doesn't have the Trojan or ransomware in it, but what it's doing is it's either leveraging a vulnerability, like in this case, where it's gaining code execution capability to then either run shell code if it's a code execution flaw and the shell code's designed to go and download and stage something that they're really trying to install, or as you alluded to, sometimes they can use macros or other scripting capabilities of Office documents. Like if you ever see a document pop up and say, do you want to enable editing? You might want to reconsider that, because that often does things like enable some of the scripts. You definitely don't want to always enable macros unless you trust the document, because that could be scripts that, to your point, would launch PowerShell. And again, the PowerShell is designed to use living off the land techniques to actually go and get the real malware that you would see on the endpoint itself if this worked.
Absolutely.
Cool.
The typical exploit is the Office file being sent over email or maybe downloaded from a file, and then it runs its macro, runs a PowerShell script that lives off the land and just in memory without actually downloading anything. And then it downloads the final payload, or maybe an intermediate payload, to infect your computer with ransomware or a remote access Trojan, something along those lines there.
Yeah, they
So,
get really good at that staging. Even the intermediate payloads are sometimes designed to, they don't want to load the malware yet because they know you might have endpoint protection. So intermediate payloads sometimes do things like try to kill processes and get rid of some of your protections to stage everything before they deliver the real malware. Great
absolutely.
points. Let's talk
Okay.
about encrypted malware, my friend.
Absolutely. So encrypted malware is something that we have added in, I think a year or two ago. And this is catching, we noticed what, like Corey was speaking about previously, only about 20% of the devices reporting, on average, it changes, but only about 20% are actually reporting on the encrypted malware. And so if we were to take a look at this count here, these two, in fact, the top three, are in the top 10 malware. And I'm just doing some basic math. If we were to take that 20%, which is one fifth of the firebox, we times each of these counts by 5, they would actually exceed, well, not all of them, but these top two would exceed the top malware in the
Yeah.
total malware trend in our top 10 list.
And you
So
made a point
really,
about that to look at that 321, and I think what you wanted to point out is, if I go back a slide, that's literally, even though we caught HTML, H, and W are 100% through encrypted, which is only, remember, 20% of our devices, it's still, that number is the exact number we see on the top malware list. So
It
imagine
would
if the other 80% were showing us that too. You're telling me it would very likely be the number one threat, probably.
absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, and obviously, we don't know for sure, but this is what the data is telling us.
Extrapolation. And I think that's really one of the huge key takeaways to this is we, for the past 3 quarters, because 80% of the reporting we get from customers are only customers looking at their clear text HTTP traffic and not actually taking advantage of the free HTTPS encryption tools. We actually think it's probably false that malware volume is dropping. Rather, we feel like what's really happening is a lot of the threat landscape is moving to encrypted connections, and that's where all the growth is happening. But until enough customers enable that protection, you're not going to see the true story. By the way, to pause here to ask you a question, I forgot to mention at the beginning that we love questions. As long as we're not over time, we'll try to actually, since two of us are speaking, I'll try to catch them and answer them live. This is not exactly related, Trevor, but one of the attendees asked, why is it that I cannot enable Gateway AV or APT blocker on my HTTPS proxy rule? Or is the HTTPS proxy rule somehow protected differently? So I'll let you answer, Trevor, but actually you do need to apply your AV settings to proxy rules. But did you want to take a whack first before I jump in, Trev?
I'm not sure if I fully understand the
Yeah.
question. What are
So
they asking?
they want to know why they can't enable AV or APT blocker on HTTP proxy. And I think the answer to that is, first, you should know uh, we sell our Firebox both with just the Firebox, which it's essentially firewall and VPN. It doesn't have any security services if you just buy the bare Firebox license. Or we sell it with basic security, which that license has a number of security services that are attached to UTM. So things like IPS, anti-malware, and a few other things. If you buy the basic security license, you get Gateway AV. But you still don't have Intelligent AV or APT blocker until you have the total security license. And as the name suggests, total security gives you everything, including APT blocker. So if you're having problems configuring Gateway AV or APT blocker, the first question is, have you bought a basic or total security license? Because you will need total to get APT and you'll need basic to get Gateway. But once you do, in order to use our malware protection, you have to attach them to our proxies. You don't actually there's a separate place to turn on and configure the services themselves. Without policy and manager, I just don't have the memory to tell you the exact steps on the call, but you go through services, you set up the services, and that will create a policy that will have your basically AV rules for that you can apply to any other policy. Then in the HTTPS proxy, or in the HTTP proxy, oh, I see. Your question was specifically the HTTPS proxy. So the key thing is, even to use the HTTPS proxy, you still need the HTTP service enabled, the normal HTTP service. And what you do is you apply AV and APT blocker to your HTTP proxy. And then when you enable HTTPS, that policy is all about getting the encryption to work, but you notice where you can set it up that you pick the rule set, the client rule set that you're going to use for HTTPS, and it essentially inherits what you've set for HTTP. That's kind of right, Trevor? I
Yep.
remember the way you set it up in the HTTPS is slightly different, but it really is just inheriting the rule set that you have set up in HTTP. It is getting the ability to block those as long as you set it up in your normal HTTP one.
Correct. Yeah, you set the HTTP proxy to the HTTPS policy, and then or HTTPS proxy policy, and then that should be configured. It could also be just make sure that you have created your unique proxy policy or unique proxy for the HTTPS so that you can edit that. If you're still having problems, I would recommend contact support if you have the full security suite you feel free to contact support and
But
they can help
yeah,
you
we
out.
do get the question now that I finally keyed on in the S in your thing. When you are using the HTTPS policy, the way you set it up is a little different, but it really is inheriting the HTTPS policy rules. So do all the setup in the normal HTTP one for the services, and when you set up the HTTPS policy, you should, just like Trevor said, pick the particular HTTP policy that has AV set up the way you want. To move right along, these are great questions, by the way, so happy to answer them, but make sure we don't go over for you. Why don't we talk a bit about widespread malware?
Sure. So what we have added our widespread malware, which is instead of just catching all of the top malware samples in our top 10 malware and our top 5 encrypted malware samples, we're catching the ones that the fireboxes see the most of. So out of all the fireboxes, we see how many fireboxes in each country and each region has seen our top widespread malware threat, the CVE 2018, the Office exploit. And so we can tell here that the first two are, I want to point out, the first two are Office exploits, 2018, 2017. Both of them we can see are hitting Greece. About a quarter of the firebox in Greece have, what this means is over a quarter of the firebox in Greece has seen these exploits here individually. If we go on the right side, we also see the regions. You can see EMEA, which is Europe and Middle East, APAC, which is Asia, also includes Australia, and then America is North and South America. And
cool.
So one sample that I would like to point out here in the U.S., we have a lot of users in the U.S., is and we often don't get as much widespread malware as far as the USA doesn't ever really come up on this list. So this is the first time, which I thought was somewhat interesting.
Very interesting.
So it's something to keep an eye on for our US users is the Agent GA-US, and we will talk about that a little bit later.
With that said, why don't you talk about some of the standout examples from the whole quarter?
Absolutely. So the JS, so we had the 3 phishing malwares. 2 of them were brand new, so this first JS Agent UNS was pointing to phishing domains, and then we have 2 phishing malwares which actually opened up the individual pages. And so the first would point to pages, the first Agent UNS would point to pages like the Amazon survey or Biden stimulus, things that look a little bit funny, and anybody if you're familiar with the web pages that are trying to phish like this, both of these web pages look very suspicious. They look like popular names, but they're not. That should absolutely raise red flags.
Trevor, I might say that the thing that probably should raise the flag is the top level domain, right? Because the actual name of the domain seems relatively legit. The key difference is, rather than the typical .com and more popular TLD, it's AmazonSurvey.rest or a Biden stimulus misspelled, so I guess there is a misspelling there that should tip it off too. But it might be just the fact that even if there was a properly spelled Biden stimulus site, it probably is going to be a .com or .org more likely than US for the real one.
And that's a good point. It's a combination of the top level domain with the popular subdomain that is familiar to most people. So on the next one, the agent, HTML agent WR, it's just a basic DHL notification page saying, hey, you have a package, go click this link, download this file because you have a package.
I feel like everyone has seen these for like UPS and FedEx, and I'm probably speaking for myself, Trevor, but I feel like they're probably effective because in this day and age of Amazon, all of us probably always kind of have a package or two coming. Like 10 years ago, it was very rare I would have packages delivered to my house, so this probably never would have worked. But now it feels like every week I'm ordering something online. So that's probably why this type of, hey, something's up with your delivery phishing works so well.
Absolutely. And from the attacker's side, if they can just send you a quick email and you're used to receiving packages and they send you a quick email and somebody clicks on it, it's obvious, they wouldn't do it if it's not working. They're trying to get return on their investment. And so unfortunately, it doesn't take very much to send these notifications and users keep on clicking on it. I think it's just they're able to send so many out without too much effort. The last one, as far as the phishing related, is Agent GBPM. Some reason the BP I cannot say in order, but that's the SharePoint phishing
We have too
page.
many acronyms in our freaking industry, Trevor. So when malware starts using random letters too, I'm with you. I never will be able to say them all correctly like
No
that.
kidding. No kidding. So anyways, this particular malware is a SharePoint phishing page, and it's kind of it tries to trick you to think that you're getting a salary increase, and if you enter in your credentials in there, it's asking for a SharePoint credentials. You're not going to get any salary increase. You're just going to be sending your credentials to the attacker, and so that's something to avoid. SharePoint, obviously, a very popular type of page to get phishing credentials from. Second to last one, Trojan Agent GAUS. If you try to Google this particular name, you're going to end up finding out it's GAUSS is what it'll show up, but this is not that malware. This is not the malware that's related to Stuxnet and Flame, and so this is lower, not as unique piece of malware. It's just simply a Ethereum miner, which is Ethereum, as you may know, is a type of crypto coin. And it's instead of you receiving any type of crypto coin from it, it just sends it all to a website, speedtest, which is spelling error.com.
No. By the way, that's not. I don't think that's a spelling error. It's a misspelling of what speed test should be, but it's intentional. That's the domain they registered to fake speed test because the real one is not available.
Correct. Yeah. Not the slide is correctly named of this domain. They actually purposely put this domain there to try and fool people into thinking this is actually speed test, which it is obviously not. So the last piece of malware that I wanted to highlight, because we are finally receiving a little bit more data from our feed on the IAV, is we did catch this form book phishing page, and this is an email that we were able to identify from the phishing page or from the phishing malware that sends a phishing page. And it's in this attached zip file, as you can see in the bottom of the page. I go into these pieces of malware a little bit more in detail in the quarterly report, so I would recommend to review those. It's at the end of the malware section, and they have pictures, kind of how it looks, so you're familiar with these malware samples.
Awesome. I'm going to do a little audible and maybe take the next slide to speed things up. Me and Trevor can talk about it. I love asking Trevor about this stuff because I find it fascinating, but I don't want to keep you guys over, so I might speed up a little bit. But before we get to Trevor to talk a little bit about regional distribution, the other thing Trevor looks at, by the way, is we showed you that zero-day malware statistic. 43% of malware got past signature-based GAV detection and required IAV and APT blocker to catch, which from all a malware perspective, that's quite a bit lower than normal. But then when Trevor looked at just the encrypted malware going through HTTPS, it turns out 70% of that was getting past signature-based protection, which is more along the lines of what we've seen recently. So to me, this just supports the transition that threat actors realize that not everyone can add security services or are taking the time to add security services to encryption because it's obviously encrypted, so it's probably a little bit harder to do. We'll talk about that because of a question in a moment. But we want to make sure you know that despite the lowering volume we are seeing overall when we include clear text traffic, we suspect that 70% and higher volume is really true, and it's just happening in encryption. And the reason I wanted to take the Trevor is one of the questions that was asked is, hey, you mentioned 20% of fireboxes only are doing this decryption. Why are the 80% not doing it? And the question was specifically, is it because of performance or configuration? So my feeling is because it's configuration. It will take a little bit of work in tuning to perfect. Now, I personally don't think it takes too much work in tuning to perfect setting it up. I think you could easily set it up in under a day, like literally in a few hours of thinking. But when you do turn it on, there might be one or two little sites that are not cooperating with you that you have to create exceptions for. So there's probably a week of occasional help desk calls where you have to do little tweaks to make sure everything works. But the key thing is, there's certainly both a performance impact and a little work to set it up. I don't think the performance impact is the problem in this day and age. 10 years ago, when we first started doing this, decrypting encrypted traffic took a lot of processing time. In fact, we even had hardware acceleration to speed it up. But nowadays, between the speed of general processors and just the power of the devices we're delivering today, even the tabletop devices, ARM chips, the power they have, while technically HTTPS decryption takes more resource to decrypt and re-encrypt as we inspect it. Usually if you get our boxes, we can do it at the line speed we advertise. And so if you, I don't know, get a T80 and you have a gigabit connection at home, typically we can do this for the amount of users you have at the speed you need. So I would say while performance was an issue 10 years ago, and it still is technically a little slower with this turned on, most people don't notice it because if you get the right hardware, we do it much quicker nowadays. I think the bigger issue is the configuration. And it's probably more the exceptions. To set this up, what you're really doing is a good guy man in the middle attack. And in order to do that, you have to have the right certificate chain of trust. What we're basically doing is you're taking a CA or a certificate authority certificate that you are going to decide that you trust, and you're going to force it to be a trusted certificate in the chain of certificate trust that TLS and SSL use. And there's two ways to do that, a way I call a hard way and an easy way. The hard way is you can do this from a client perspective where you can export a special certificate that's on the Firebox, a CA certificate, and you can find a way to deploy that certificate to all the clients that you want to do this decryption. That can be a pain in the butt, right? I mean, even with group policy where you can push it to browsers like IE, what about if users have different browsers? What about other types of clients that aren't technically browsers but use HTTPS? Having to deliver that certificate and get it installed in the right places on the clients would be a very big pain in the butt, and is the way that a lot of people still try to do it because that used to be the traditional way. There's a much easier way. And that is, if you're a typical Active Directory Windows user, you have a CA certificate for your domain. You already have one, and you can import that certificate to the Firebox rather than use the Firebox and tell the Firebox that this is my domain CA cert that I want to use. And if you're doing that with AD, all the devices you've probably already set up with it are already using that certificate as part of their trust. So that is like the one step easier way to set this up. But basically the hardest part of setting it up is that certificate, whether you're importing one to the Firebox, the easier way, or you're trying to export the Fireboxes to all the clients you want to turn it on. That's really the hardest step of the setup. But once you know how to do it, it's actually very easy. The bigger issue is when programs like a Dropbox application might use something called certificate pinning. So if your users go to Dropbox using a normal web browser, we capture and decrypt the traffic fine. But if you use the Dropbox app, it actually is tied to wanting a very specific certificate and doesn't let the man-in-the-middle attack happen at all. And you just can't use the Dropbox client without actually making an exception for it. So the other part of it is there are occasional cases where you just have to not inspect the encrypted traffic because the site did some sort of certificate pinning, or application is looking for something specific, and you do have to make exceptions in those cases. So it's really that a lot of people just don't want other new help desk calls, so they avoid doing this. But I feel like you won't, if you set it up right with some of our default exceptions, it's not really that long before you have all the exceptions you need. So I still recommend the work is worth it. There are easier ways to set it up. Don't do it the hard way, do it the easy way. And know that you will have to make some exceptions over time, but that work is definitely worth it. So I probably over answered the question, but that is why we suspect people haven't set it up, because it does take a little bit of work on your side to do and to tune, but we believe it's very well worth it. Sorry for that soapbox, Trevor, but why don't we drop back to the last bit of the malware section?
No worries. Yeah, no, that's some very good points to cover. And I think some people are asking for some articles on kind of how to do that, and I can certainly provide those here later. So let's go ahead and take a look at the malware by region section. Just going over it really quick, we can see this total malware by Firebox. EMEA sees much more malware per Firebox than Americas, and a little bit more than APAC. Again, APAC is the Asia, Australia. EMEA is the Europe, Africa. Americas it's North and South America. And so these are, we're not quite sure why these numbers are so different, but this is the malware that we tend to see, and it's pretty typical of what we see quarter over quarter.
Yep, cool. And so now let's get to the network attacks. And for this, I will speed up a little because I think Trevor and I alluded to it before. Lately, we're trying to find ways to make this section a little more interesting, because it's gotten, when we look at the top volume lists, they remain pretty stagnant. The same attacks show up over and over. So won't spend a lot of time on it. But the first thing we want to look at is, here is a chart for network attacks in general over the past, let's say 3-4 years. It's showing each quarter on a chart. As you can see, basically around Q1, Q2 of 2021, and then again in Q4, we had big increases in network attacks. IPS hits from Firebox out there went from 5 million to 6 million during that time. But our average is more around a 2 to 3 million. And as you can see, the last 2 quarters, it's really hovered right around 2 million. So not only is it the same type of attacks, but you can see between Q3 and Q4, it literally plateaued. In fact, there was technically a growth of IPS hits this quarter, Q4 compared to Q3, but it's literally something like 0.0015%. The only interesting thing about the quarter was it was something like only 32 or 35 additional hits. And if you think that the difference of 35 when you're talking numbers that are 2 million, it was almost a repeat of Q4. So really, network attacks don't seem to be blowing up the last few quarters. They really hit a peak last year at Q4. We do suspect that the same story we're telling you about malware and HTTPS applies here too, though. Realize that IPS also happens both over encrypted and non-encrypted connections. As you'll see in a moment, most of the network attacks we see are web-based network attacks. And that means really, if most of the web traffic is HTTP, look at any report and you'll see for the biggest sites, like 99% of traffic is HTTPS, is encrypted. If you're not looking at the traffic, you're missing where all the network attacks are. And we haven't really traditionally looked at IPS from an HTTPS level yet. Probably something we should start to do, because we think the volume of IPS is really not as low as it seems, but what's happening is everything is happening in the encrypted connections. One other stat we look at that I'm not going to pay too much attention to is the amount of unique IPS signature hits we get every quarter. So is it the same attacks being done over and over, or are our attackers adding new exploits and new exploits or vulnerabilities to their library? And you can see Q4 very similar to the past 3 quarters, 464 different signatures we saw throughout the quarter. It wasn't a big peak like Q1 2022 was, but it's certainly not lower than any quarter either. Getting to the top network attacks, I'm probably not going to cover any of these in big detail, but I'll talk about trends. There was really only one hit that was new to the list, and it's only new in the specific detection. It's that web SQL injection attempt, but that's one of many ways we have to generically catch Windows SQL injections. So this particular 25A rose to hit the top 10 for the first time in the past few years. Meanwhile, everything else was something that was on the top 10 list before. They just changed order a bit here and there. As you can see, the most common things we see are all web-based. They're typically attacks against web clients or web servers. All the stuff on the top, the directory traversal, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, they're all attacking web applications, so servers hosting web apps. And they're generic. They're not looking for a particular like an IIS flaw or a framework flaw. They're probably ways of looking at a custom coded web app and trying to break into it. So instead of going into all of them, really know the theme is lots of web application attempts against web servers that you host publicly for business reasons. So that really was the theme of this quarter. From a geographic perspective, like Trevor just did for malware, for the first time in a while, we saw most of these network attacks hit the Americas. One thing to note about how we do geographic distribution, before we used to do it by raw numbers, meaning just how many hits happen in the US period, and Americas would always win. But later on, we started to actually tune it to the amount of fireboxes. We realized depending on where WatchGuard has sales, there may be more fireboxes in one region than another. So we actually normalized this to the amount of fireboxes in the different areas. So it's a more realistic idea of where the volume really is. And as soon as we started doing that, EMEA started to sometimes hit #1. But this quarter, the Americas hit #1. You might be asking, by the way, do we know why some quarters malwares or network attacks are focused on one region or not? We always are curious ourselves. So we always try to hypothesize and find data that will quantify it. But we simply don't have enough data to tell you for sure why the Americas seem to be more targeted this quarter than Europe or APAC. I suspect that they may have found a particular type of server that was more prominent there that they might have attacked, or sometimes it could be seasonal, like during the holidays they might focus on a country that has a particular holiday with certain attacks. So that's the network perspective. The last thing that I actually think I will skip going into too much detail for time's sake is our DNS watch section. And this is where we talk about the top domains that we saw during the quarter. Now, top domains, we actually have many more categories than the 3 you see here, but the 3 we report on are malware domains. So what that means is it's a domain that's hosting either a command and control infrastructure for malware, or it's one of the drive-by downloading servers where it's distributing malware. Phishing, that's a gimme. You guys know exactly what that is. It's a fake or spoof site trying to phish some information. And compromised is one I find the most interesting, because a compromised domain is typically a legitimate domain that actually a company has a legitimate purpose for, but whether a bad guy exploited one of those web application vulnerabilities I mentioned before to take over the domain, or just found a flaw where they could inject a little extra code into the legitimate domain. Compromised means it's a domain that is legitimate, but has at least temporarily had something done to it so that it's distributing something malicious. To really quickly go over this list, let me go ahead and, oops, sorry, I'm looking at different slides and I don't have my forwarder. I'm going ahead and build out these highlights. For time's sake, I'm barely going to cover these, but just know that some of the domains that were new to the list that we looked a bit more into, Green Window is a domain we've talked about before. It was originally classified as a phishing domain, but some changes happened to basically turn it into a C2 server that's delivering malware from mouse spam emails. When we say mouse spam emails, it's very basic email that's spam to millions of people, but typically have malicious links that try to deliver malware. Skyprobar.info, just know it as a C2 domain that's being used by at least one of the variants of Emotet coming back. GrainerX is actually normally a health and wellness site. This is the administration domain for that health and wellness site, but it must have suffered some sort of configuration problem or vulnerability because we have been seeing it used by malicious actors. So that's the compromised domain. And finally, the customerportal.info one just has been hosting many different phishing campaigns over a period of time. And a lot of those are doing things like using fictional voicemail messages attached to an email to try to phish a user to answer some exec or something, or doing something like a pretend OneDrive login that looks very similar to OneDrive, is probably using the actual assets of the real cloud OneDrive, but is really a man in the middle phishing the credentials. So just a quick list of the domains we see. To follow up with this one, Trevor, why don't we go through the tips? I think you have the first one.
Yep, I'll go ahead and go. I'm just going to cover it really quickly for time's sake. Leveraging AI malware detection. We strongly recommend, based on the data that we see, to use the IAV, which is a machine learning algorithm with dedicated modules to catch malware and return whether the malware is, or whether the file is malware or whether it is goodware. And so we recommend leveraging that because of the quick response, and it's not solely based on signatures, so you don't have to, it can catch zero-day malware, which is malware that we have never seen before. So
good job. Yeah, scan HTTPS traffic. I'm not going to talk about this one anymore. I'll talk about it a little more in our conclusion, but I think you all know this from how much time we've already dedicated to it. We're seeing all the trends are, the attacks are happening there. They're not happening in clear text HTTP traffic as often anymore. So if you're not scanning that, as approximately 80% of the people reporting in are not doing, you're missing all that. So take the time to set that up. Go ahead, Trev.
And so for security equals communication, we highly recommend that the security department, so like Corey's and my team, that we try to communicate with IT, we try to communicate with our sales and support. And so to any of the new vulnerabilities, make sure they know of what's happening, any hardware vulnerabilities, and then they communicate back to us about anything that you guys report, any findings about issues, or maybe even like the configuration, that default configuration that could be adjusted. So we take those, we communicate during the meetings, and this helps the security culture and helps the overall security environment.
Yeah, if I'd say it slightly differently, a typical security professional, I'm speaking for myself and maybe Trevor, but I suspect it's the same for all of you. We're very technical, and we often solve security problems from a technical aspect. How can I prevent it using technical controls and stuff? But the truth is, as any CISO knows, most of the real security work you're doing for a corporation is communicating with other departments. And the reason you want that clear and transparent and open communication is to get buy-off on changes you have to make, to get support and changes in behavior from people. Even if you have great security controls like some of the ones WatchGuard offers, bad user behavior, doing the wrong thing can sometimes hurt you. And let me tie it to HTTPS traffic. When you're doing a change where you want to get better security as the CISO office, like you want to start decrypting HTTPS, but you know there might be a little bit of friction associated with it. There might be sites that are occasionally blocked. Before you enable that policy, a good thing to do is to communicate with the whole company. Don't just tell them prescriptively from the ivory tower, you're doing this and that's the way it's going to be, but instead tell you, here's something we're hoping to do by this time. We're doing it because of XYZ, you know, kind of educate them on the importance of how it helps them and keeps them safe. And then ask them if you see any issues in getting to certain sites, here's how you can report them to us and we can quickly fix it. So we just wanted to point out a kind of non-technical thing that's super important. As a CISO, you know, the technical problems I worked on as an analyst really aren't as much my day-to-day as it is the communication necessary to make sure that the company's following the policies that I send out. Let's talk about endpoint. We do love interaction, so even though we don't have much time, let's go to the first polling question, which if you were paying attention, this is kind of the pay attention question because we gave a preview of it in the highlights. How much did ransomware detection increase from an endpoint perspective in Q4? I'm not going to be a jerk, but I can definitely, not everyone missed the quick highlight we had in the highlight section. So surprisingly, the answers on this are mixed. And the real answer is, if you pop up the results, it looks like a pretty evenly mixed between 239% and 627, as well as a bunch in between. But one of our big highlights was between Q3 and Q4 from an endpoint level, we saw a 627% increase in ransomware on the endpoint. So it was a pretty huge increase. And this comes after a number of quarters where we've talked about ransomware detections were going down, and it seemed like threat actors weren't paying as much attention. But the first big trend from the report is ransomware explodes. Trevor, we'll have to make it go very, very quick, but another trend is how malware arrives on the endpoint. So did you want to cover that?
Sure. So like I was mentioning earlier, we see mostly scripts on the endpoints. And so just like we see in general, mostly Office exploits on the network side. And so, but when we see, as pointing out here, we do see a tiny bit of Office exploits because there's different types of exploits that Office has. There's half a dozen at this point. So anyways, the PowerShell, primarily PowerShell scripts are what we see mostly in the endpoint software.
Technically, it could be JavaScript and VB script too, but I think the exact number, one, if you do have time to read the report, we don't only talk about Q4 in the endpoint section, but the author talks about the whole year in review since it was the last quarter of the year. And I think, while, you know, this sounds like just me copying a number, 90% of the script malware we saw during the whole year was PowerShell script. So even though JavaScript and VB script have been effective for bad guys in the past, they really are using a lot of malicious PowerShell.
Correct. This 90% includes all types of scripts, and then about 90% or whatever that percentage is of this 90% is just PowerShell. So if we were to remove the PowerShell, then what we'll find out is it's mostly Windows. So it's going to be like Windows exe files, or perhaps a library DLL type file, and then followed by browsers and Acrobat and others. Yeah. And so that's the overall if we were to remove the scripts.
And for time's sake, Trevor, this is the yearly view showing a little bit of quarterly breakdown for the year, but I think I'll skip this if that's okay, Trev. Other folks can see it in the slides. I really want to speed through this for people's time. Another interesting thing that I really recommend you check out in the report is we have started also tracking ransomware groups based on their underground channels and seeing which ransomware groups have had the most successful extortions. You probably know the top names because you see them the headlines, but our findings show that Lockbit, Black Cat, the group, and Royal are the ransomware groups that seem to be doing the most attacks out there and have caught the most victims that they're currently extorting. Lots of great data in the report that goes into that in detail. The last thing I'm only going to highlight, because really you need to read the report to get the cool technical detail, but I mentioned the story of the month was the LastPass breach. I'm sure most of you heard that LastPass had a network breach basically of some of their cloud assets, but it was pretty big. The threat actors got access to some of the cloud infrastructure that included clients' vaults where all the passwords were. Now, there's good news here is the way LastPass encrypts vaults where they don't even have the keys, the private key, only you do. Technically, the bad guys don't have your passwords, even though that they have that encrypted vault. Now, depending on what you used for the master password, if you used a very weak master password, they could have cracked your vault. So do consider that. But if you used a relatively long and strong master password, you should be fine. There were other pieces of data stolen too that could affect you, so settings you might want to change. Definitely read the report for the details. But the main part of our report was talking about how. How did this happen? And the too long didn't listen answer is, it really comes down to the personal network of a senior DevOps engineer. Basically, one of their key engineers works from home like many of us, and he has a home network. And while this hasn't been confirmed by the company itself, many researchers have shared compelling data that seem to suggest that that senior DevOps personal computer, Plex Media Server, they had Plex. Plex is obviously a cool audio video media server you can use to stream malware, or I'm sorry, stream, you can understand what word I use a lot more than the other, stream media all over your network. And it had a older flaw, an authenticated flaw that allowed bad guys to remove code. The report talks about a lot of detail about how this deserialization flaw works, and it was part of a pickle serial library that Plex uses. We won't cover it. You should really read the report so you can follow through the code detail. But the basics are, the threat actor was able to pop this personal home computer. They likely were able to get the password to use this authenticated attack through some sort of, through Plex's breach. Plex had their own breach that lost user information, and the threat actor probably took advantage of some of the changing of passwords then to get the authentication. And we suspect once they got access to this personal computer Plex device, they started keylogging. And when they started keylogging, the DevOps engineer entered his normal corporate credentials in at some point when connecting back to work. And that is likely how they got the credentials necessary to gain access to LastPass's network. So the two things is it's an inadvertent supply chain type thing, not supply chain as in LastPass got their software hacked, but as in other products led to a vulnerability that people were able to use to pivot to bigger and better targets. And the other thing is the separation of personal and business data. The fact that this homework, this user worked from home, not a big deal if done right, but without the right policy, if they're sometimes logging in from personal computers and you, of course, have no control of the security of their personal computer, that could lead to an issue. So sorry I'm going so quickly, but again, want to respect your time. Very interesting part of the report. I recommend you read it. But to end with the final takeaways, we just want to leave you with, be sure to scan encrypted traffic. You've heard it a million times today, but we suspect malware and network attacks are not lowering. All the action is happening in encrypted traffic. We also want to remind you, especially from the network level, to talk about making sure you have a great patching process. You already know to patch, so we're not going to talk about patching itself, but one of the things we do to make sure that we're patching quickly is both create and keep track of patching SLAs or MTTPRs, which is mean time to repair. Make sure that you have rules for how long before you require IT to patch a external critical vulnerability versus an external critical vulnerability. External ones should be patched really quickly, like 24 to 48 hours. Internal ones, maybe you have a bit more time because they're not as exposed, so a week. But a critical should be patched way faster than a low, and a medium and high, a high faster than a medium. What you need to do as a security organization is define those meantime SLAs, and then you need to monitor them so that if you see you're not getting to certain patches in the time you've defined, that's monitoring them, making key health metrics out of them is what's going to give you the data you need to go back and make sure anyone that helps with the patching process, like the actual IT folks, do it. And finally, because of the story, we also recommend you separate business and personal. I would love to talk about it more, but I don't want to steal more of your time. So thank you everyone who's gone over an hour. You can learn a lot more about this by coming to Secplicity, where we have other resources. But with that, why don't we walk through some questions? Thank you for the great presentation stuff. So one of the questions, was it a Plex server on a separate machine than the employee's work computer? And again, remember, this is all alleged because we're working off bits of information that other researchers have learned. So there's enough quantifiable evidence that give researchers strong understanding that it was a Plex server. But again, this is not being confirmed by LastPass. But yes, everything we saw seems to suggest the Plex server wasn't literally on the corporate-owned computer. There was a separate corporate-owned computer, which presumably had more protections that I believe this engineer also used at home. And this Plex server was just a personal computer from the way we understand it. That said, once you get a keylogger on a network, especially an internal network, we don't know whether or not it was the keylogger capturing a network credential that really came from the corporate computer, which is possible with things like Mimikatz and other tools that look at pass the hash over the network and even look at Kerberos tickets over the network, or if it was he maybe used a web app from the personal computer. So he logged into something corporate, even though he was on the personal one at the time, not the corporate one. So yes, the rumor is it probably was the server on, at least he didn't install the server on the corporate computer. But I would warn, as a CISO and as someone that has seen employees install all kinds of apps on their corporate computer, I would not be surprised to see some employees actually install Plex servers on corporate devices too. So I think my real answer is you should worry about both somebody doing something from a personal computer that gives up a corporate credential and someone installing something on a corporate computer that might be personal in nature and expose some personal risk. Going quickly for folks' time, there have been multiple questions that I saw at the time, but I had to go quickly, talking about when we talked about regionality of some of these threats, both network and malware. A number of people mentioned the Russian-Ukrainian war. And I agree with all of you who mentioned that. While the actual conflict may have only started about a year ago, the ones that was physical in nature, it was building up to that war for a long time. One person mentioned 2014. And if you follow Black Energy or you follow the Russian GRU APT threat actor, one of their campaigns was Black Energy, where long before the whole world knew of this physical war that started too, Russia was doing cyber attacks, taking out power, doing various DDoS attacks, likely in preparation of going to this real war too. And the other part of that war, as everyone probably does know, is as soon as the physical real war started, you got a two-way cyber war that's kind of causing collateral damage all over the world. I think one person mentioned this in context to maybe that's why we're seeing more attacks in Europe than we saw before. But the truth is, I think the collateral damage happens even in the US because you have both Russian side hacktivists and Ukrainian side hacktivists. And when I say hacktivists, these may not even be Ukrainian and Russian citizens participating. They're definitely participating because they're in a direct conflict. But there's people around the world that have support one or the other. Hopefully most support Ukraine. That's my personal preference, not necessarily, but actually it's WatchGuard's preference too. We don't sell to Russia right now. So hopefully more people that support Ukraine, but we've seen global hacktivists start participating in kind of a cyber war of their own, depending on what side they report. So very interesting points by a few of you, and I tend to agree. We don't have the quantifiable data to say for sure that's part of some of our trends, but it's definitely a macro global trend we've been following. Just going through the rest of the things, I do think for time, I do want to let you guys go. Thank you so much for your time and for those who stayed over. We do tend to keep all these questions that we don't answer, so there's a chance we can answer some of these in email, but hopefully we got to all of them. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Trevor, for joining me. And sorry we went over. All I can say is Trevor and I are passionate about cybersecurity and about the trends we find. So thank you so much for watching, everyone.